Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show that takes place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today's episode is all about games that are quintessentially Jake.
That's me.
Yeah. We're going to spend the next hour or so focusing our lens on Jake and Jake's tastes and explore games that demonstrate something specific about the type of games Jake enjoys from the perspective of decision spaces. And we hope this one, as a listener of Decision Space, this will be interesting to you and inform your ability to understand what Jake says in future episodes. But also, we think this might equip you with the tools to talk about your own quintessential taste from the perspective of Decision Space too. So yeah, that's today's episode.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to dive in. It's fun being on the hot seat like this. And I had a hard time thinking through this question. I picked the brains of a lot of friends and people in our Discord sort of around the idea of, is your quintessential game the same thing as your top 10 list or not? And I think it's ultimately not. It's really, the way I interpreted this was really in thinking about the games that define my taste. So like my top 10 list might include games that's like, I tend to not like this mechanism, but this is an exception. And like that wouldn't fit on this list, I think, for me. Because that, right, it being an exception means it's not like a quintessential version of like what I love in games. So that's kind of how I thought about it and really thought through what would be the games that if you played these games, you would know what I like.
Well put.
At the end of it.
Let's do that. Also, I think this is not about me, but in terms of quintessential, I think sometimes top whatever lists, you might have the same type of game multiple times if you just really loved that type of game. But here we're trying to talk about games that illustrate different points about your taste overall.
Right.
So that redundancy that might make sense in a top 10 if you just love a specific game and it's a list of your favorite games wouldn't make sense. But here might if it illustrates something important about your enjoyment of specific games.
Yeah. I think that sort of thought experiment is a useful one for listeners for all the reasons you said. And it also might just be fun to do on your own as you listen along, is if you had the opportunity and privilege to sit down somebody who's maybe not as versed in modern games and said, here, play these 10 games so that at the end of those games, they would know what you like in games. Like, what would you pick? That's kind of the thought experiment that I ultimately ended up with for what makes a game like quintessentially me.
Cool. Okay, before we get into it, we always like to read reviews that come in out on the show. And today we have a review on Spotify. It was left as a comment on the 5 Tribes episode. So if you listen to Decision Space on Spotify and you want to rate our show and then leave a comment on one of the episodes, giving us a review there, we're happy to read that out on the show too. That we especially appreciate you pointing out the fact to us, maybe through our Discord, that you've done this so we know where to find it. But today we're reading a review from Evan Hayes. And Evan says, "Hi guys, relatively new listener, and just want to say thanks for what you do. You've helped me realize that decisions are one of the main reasons I love games. You're also both very thoughtful about games and help me appreciate them in new ways. One question on Moncala-style games like 5 Tribes, which I've played once and enjoyed. Have either of you played Come Sail Away? It's right at the top of my wish list, but can't seem to be able to get a copy right now. Cheers."
Awesome. Thanks so much, Evan, for the comment and question. And Evan reached out to us by Gmail so email us at decisionspacepodcast@gmail.com. And that's another great way you can contact us if you don't want to fuss with Discord. I have not played Come Sail Away. I'm interested to, because I'm really interested in all of the Sashi or maybe it's just Sashi period games. So I'd be excited to give that a try. Brendan, have you played this one?
I have not played Come Sail Away. Come Sail Away has Takako Takahari art, which is very eye-catching and looks like a heavier Sashi game. So no, I liked to get on board but didn't love it. You love Photograph. And also Coffee Roasters is a game of Sashi's that's also quite popular that I haven't played. But this looks like one of the heavier games that I've seen designed by Sashi. So I don't know anything about this. So I'll just say, Evan, thank you for telling me about Come Sail Away. It looks interesting.
If we do play it, we'll bring our thoughts here to the podcast.
Yeah.
One other update, and this one's a really important update for me personally that has implications for this podcast is that my wife and I are expecting to welcome our first child in December. Our due date is December 9th. So, anytime thereabouts, you could expect an interruption in this show. I don't really know what that's going to look like yet. Maybe I'll be rocking a newborn to sleep while editing the podcast, or maybe that will feel impossible to do. Obviously, the podcast is going to be taking a backseat for me in terms of life priorities for that period, but it's definitely something that's important to me to continue to do. So maybe that'll look like some additional episodes with featuring Brendan and another guest without me, and I can still do some editing on the side, or maybe it'll just be a week or two off where we play some re-listening episodes before I feel comfortable to get back into it. More updates to come on that, but extremely excited for this big life development. And Decision Space isn't going anywhere. I just don't know what that's going to look like for my involvement in the show for that first newborn stage, as this is all completely new to me.
And we are so excited for you, Jake, that the player count possibilities of just games within your home one day is increasing. So congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, and I was just talking to Paul, and he's like, "Yeah, we need to play a game before you're never able to play any games ever again." It's like, okay.
Paul says as someone who does have a child.
Yeah, he's got a couple, so he knows exactly how real that possibility is, I guess.
Totally.
So anyway, that's the exciting update. We should probably get on with the show, but appreciate all the good vibes and well wishes that I'm receiving from listeners right now. I can sense it.
So in this episode, we've kind of taken the approach, Jake, of I've written notes about what I think are quintessentially Jake things in games, and I'm going to talk through some of them, and then you're going to pontificate and respond to them.
Perfect.
And I thought a good place to start might be, if you had to pick a single length of game, what would you pick to say that's the quintessential length of game that you would pick if you could only play one type of game? And I thought you would pick medium to long games. Something like a Stefan Feld game that comes in between 60 and 90 minutes seems like the sweet spot for you in terms of if you could only own one type of game in your collection or have one type of game playing experience ever again. I felt like that's the way that you would run. Or at least maybe if I don't put all these extra frames that complicate the question, that you sort of prefer medium to long games, not really long and not necessarily short games. You also have a sort of aptitude for, desire of, an affection for short games, like opening kind of 15-minute or less games that are approachable. But I think ultimately your taste lie with this medium to long games area. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you have nailed it. The first thing I'd be able to eliminate is long games. I think I have a slight aversion to games that I expect to go 2 hours or longer.
Mm-hmm.
It's just rare that I want to commit that much time, and that ends up being kind of a once, twice, or thrice a year games where I'll say, hey, let's set aside my birthday and play something a bit meatier, or at a gaming convention or something, I'll play something a bit heavier, but just typically not something I want to do during a normal week. And then I think there's sort of a length that becomes kind of like an uncanny valley length for me too, which are games that are kind of more than 30 minutes, but less than an hour, that can kind of leave me feeling sometimes these games can be really great, but can sort of make me less likely to want to bring them out. Cause I feel like they're like just short of a full game experience in that kind of classic midweight Euro length of 60 to 90. So I think those are my two sweet spots, would be really short games that you can get in a couple times over lunch, introduce people without feeling like I'm occupying too much of their time and space. And then, for me, in kind of my perfect idealized game night, the main game of the evening would be sort of that 90-minute full game experience that doesn't overstay its welcome.
Yeah. Cool. So something like Kingdomino, maybe a little bit too late for you, lies in that uncanny, quintessentially Jake Valley of this is a little light, but not light enough, and certainly not heavy enough. Do you think that's fair?
In terms of, so are you switching it to weight or from
length? I guess.
Yeah. I think Kingdomino is actually one that I would include in sort of like, it's short enough. I'm looking over at my shelf and I see there's really not too many of these games that would fall more in that 45-minute length. I think two on there were San Francisco by Reiner Knizia. It's a game I've played once because it felt like not quite a full game, but a little bit too long to be a short game. Another one on there is Tournament of at Avalon, a trick-taking game that feels like it overstays its welcome in terms of time played. Walking in Burano is another game that's just almost, a game that feels like it's approaching the length of a full game, but not quite providing that full game experience. And I think that tends to be this kind of like 45-minute to 60-minute uncanny valley for me.
Cool. Okay, so that if we've kind of talked about length, I think that gives us a scope that we're kind of honing in on. Not to say you don't like games that fall out of there, but games that are quintessentially Jake probably do fall in that game length. So then I have a list of characterizations of just qualities in games that reminded me of things that you like. Where I was just thinking about games Jake generally likes, and these feel like similarities that a lot of them share. So I think, Jake, that quintessentially Jake games have sort of moderate clarity. You tend to not prefer games that are completely clear decision spaces, right? Something like an abstract game like chess, or even I don't know, Onitama or something like that, where the decisions that you're making, the uncertainty is coming strictly from what the other player is doing, not from something about the game state, this unknown piece of information that you have to constantly be speculating about or thinking about in some way. But you also tend to not like games that are completely opaque in terms of there's just so much variability and so much uncertainty that you don't really know what you're supposed to do because it's just random. Or that are so complex that you can't solve a puzzle, that you just have to act on instincts alone.
Yeah, that's correct. I definitely, I think particularly just to hone in on that feeling more with the high clarity games, right? These are kind of like the approaching zero luck, right? No randomness games. I just find them stressful, right? It makes me feel too much like we're at a battle of wits and trying to figure out who's the smarter person in the context of this game. And that's fine for, a chess tournament setting where that's exactly what you're doing. But I don't really want to kind of bring that chess tournament setting into my living room at game night too often.
Yeah.
So I think that, and even games like In the Year of the Dragon by Stefan Feld, where you just get so much clear information up front, it can a little bit too much for my taste bring in, those feelings of players feeling smart, players feeling dumb when mistakes are made because they feel like so unavoidable, or they feel very avoidable in hindsight. Kind of that feeling of like taking your finger off the piece and then you see, the disaster that's coming your way. That feels a lot worse to me, and I tend to not like that as much when that disaster would have been knowable to you if you were like a little bit smarter, a little more in tune to the game. It feels a bit better when there's at least some element of mitigating input or output randomness where you're like, yeah, in hindsight that was a mistake, but also I can protect myself and by the feeling like that at least I got a little bit unlucky there in addition to making a bad mistake.
Yeah, it's my perception that you definitely love games where when you win, you feel really smart, but when you lose, there is the chance of having the cushion of there was this uncertainty, there was this randomness, I couldn't plan perfectly, which I think is perfectly great.
Totally.
That's a natural space that we all love games. A lot of people love games to exist in.
Yeah, and it's a funny form of sort of psychological doublethink that I think we often do at the subconscious level, right? I play a lot of fantasy football with my friends, and that game is famous for like when your team does well, you feel so smart, and when your team does bad, it's like there's no skill in this game. It's obviously all luck because we're just, randomly picking these football players and seeing how they perform without any kind of agency. Or, well, my person got injured, so like of course, I couldn't have done anything about that. And when it's going well for you, you're like chatting to your league mates and calling them a bunch of dummies for letting you, score so many
have
points.
Such a massive brain.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that it's something I think try and have some self-awareness about as I'm picking games and purchasing games and bringing games out for friends, knowing that this is a common psychological thing.
Yeah.
And I think another piece of that too is just the fact that I don't like, even if I'm doing well, right? Because I, as the person who's owns the game and bringing it out and has some experience with it, like I don't want, also don't want the people I'm playing with to feel bad or feel like it's unfair because I have more experience, which is also I think a common refrain when it comes to these no luck games.
Totally.
And then on the other side of the coin too, I want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to feel like there are smart decisions to be made in the game. I'm trying to think of a game that's like so too random for me, in terms of sort of the decision space clarity. And I think one of them was Captain Flip a little bit.
Mm,
Like I ultimately was too unsettled by that randomness of the flip mechanism to feel like the decision space was fully satisfying to me on like a clarity level.
cool. Okay, so kind of, I think in line with that point, I have a perception, Jake, that you like high search games. So games where there are lots of options available to the players, and part of the game playing experience is solving a turn by turn puzzle of finding what feels like the optimal or close enough to optimal move. I think you have a proclivity towards these sort of thinky games that if a game was set up on the table, you'd be happy to chew on a game state for a few minutes, not longer than anyone would socially sort of what would be comfortable for whatever group you had. But you like games that give you space to play in and evaluate certain decisions against one another. And you lean towards having too many rather than too few, but you don't want it to be so many that you don't have a sense of the clarity.
Yeah. Probably for all of these decision space categories, we're looking for my sweet spot and to
Sure.
some extent. So almost never, I think being kind of an omni gamer to some extent, right? Liking all kinds of different games, it's going to put you into the somewhere in between the extremes on most of these categories. But I think high search, having a lot of different options on your turn, is a place where I'm closer to the extreme side
Yeah.
than most gamers. I really like that. And that's something that I came up with as well when I was sort of thinking through characteristics in games that I really enjoy. And I think a part of that for me is I also love feeling like I'm learning and growing in games, maybe more than most people. Like that, those kind of feelings of I just learned something new about the game system is like that. Having that experience with a game is for me like the pinnacle of gaming. Like I just absolutely love those little uh, moments, and I think having a really high search game enables a lot of those moments because as you grow in your skill in a certain game, you'll having all those different options in front of you just leads to more opportunities to say, "Oh, I've never considered this
Mm,
option, but now that I've played this game 6 times and seen more of the system, I'm understanding like why that actually might be worth doing this time around." Or I played this game 6 times and I've never seen this path open up in the way that it is this time as a viable path forward. And either of those things happening to me is just like bliss. And I feel as though in a high search game, you just get more of that happening per play.
so games that leave space for the joy of epiphany.
Yeah.
And I think now that I'm looking at the other characterizations that I haven't even discussed yet, I completely see that as being a through line through a lot of the games that on their face value seem really different, but why you like them. So even something like Challengers and Tikal, really, really different games, but the joy of Epiphany can exist in both of those game playing experiences. And maybe that's kind of the foundation on which the quintessentially Jake game is built. So my next one is after high search is action efficiency. And I think that actually is T-Call is a really good example of a game with high search and action efficiency, where you're searching essentially for the most efficient way to a certain set number of points this turn that sets you up for more points on future turns. I like T-Call. I think it's fine. But I would say you have great affection for T-Call. And I think a huge part of that is this sort of action efficiency. You like, and I think maybe the action efficiency in general is sort of tied to what you just said. The more you play these games, the more you see how you can be more efficient. So they tend to have more room for better, more reliable feedback about your growth compared to maybe a game that has less room for feedback.
Yeah. This is an interesting one. this might be an area where
And
I
you can
either
say no, you can
I either
disagree.
push back a little bit
Yeah.
or I don't know that action efficiency is the right frame. I think there's something there, but I feel like it's more to do with kind of like games that enable almost an organic play space. And I
Mm,
think a lot of games do that with action efficiency. Like Tikal, that sort of is your currency, is your
mm.
actions. Um,
Yeah, what do you mean by organic play space in this context?
yeah, that's what I'm trying to think about.
Sure,
And
yeah.
yes, I don't know that I have the right words either, but there's something. The thing that in T-Call that I like so much is that like, what you're doing on your turn feels so organic and different based on the game state as it unfolds each time. You know,
Ah,
it's like I feel like I want to just be water in that game and kind of let my
mm,
workers on the board flow into the places that there is least resistance for them
yeah,
and use the actions that I have available in that same way and just kind of like that feeling of like sort of being putty on the board. And in that game, it's totally tied to action efficiency. It's one and the same, right? That
yeah,
is the action efficiency. But I don't know that it's necessarily because I just feel like that's almost too not specific enough because so many games are all about action efficiency. Almost any Euro game I can think of is kind of like, yeah, you want to be efficient with your action, but there's something in a game like that that feels like it allows for sort of efficiency through organic play in that way.
yeah.
That makes it something that I really love, and it's hard for me to put my finger on exactly what the right kind of frame is for that feeling.
I think your affinity for Euros is worth exploring in this episode because something you just said, I think, is quintessentially Jake, right? Like the fact that you enjoy Euro games. You're like, yeah, any game with action, all Euro games have action efficiency. That's showing an affinity for this type of game. But I also, interpreting what you're saying, Jake, it sounds like you have a preference for games that are more tactical than strategic, right? You'd rather sitting down to play a game, figure out what you're supposed to do rather than sit down and sort of saying, I want to try this strategy out. I'm going to play this faction and execute on this strategy. And I think that aligns with this other sort of characterization that I had, was that you like games that have a sort of find the path puzzle factor, games that have this open play area where the fun of the game and playing the game well means you're navigating this sort of open, lots of broad decisions. The decision space is very large and wide. There are lots of options presented. And the fun of the game is trying to figure out the right path through that very open decision tree. So, as an example of that, a game that came to mind for me that has this quality that you really enjoy is Bonfire, where you're
Mhm.
presented with all these different options that look similar ish. And you can pivot fairly easily between them. So the game itself is identifying what you should be doing, when you should be doing it, and in sort of what sequence you should prioritize those things.
Yeah, I definitely like those kind of games. It ties in with the high search and action efficiency. It's
Yeah.
kind of a through line where you'll tend to find those things in these find the path puzzle games. But yeah, games that have that kind of more of a sandbox feel, where you're trying to figure out what's the most efficient thing to do from a wide range of options, is definitely an experience that I enjoy quite a lot.
Yeah. A Feast for Odin comes to mind as another example of a game that kind of feels like this. So
Totally.
another characterization of a through line, and that's a game that you really enjoy.
Oh yeah.
I should say, uh, as I get to dictate your tastes, I guess, here in the way we structured this
Well,
episode.
it's good. It's good. I like
Yeah.
it because yeah, you get it's interesting too to know how my tastes show up to you who I've talked
Mm.
about my taste in board games with more than anyone else on the planet.
Sure, that's true. I do think this is why I expected you to really love Great Western Trail. When we first started playing it, on sort of all accounts, I had this feeling that, oh, this is going to be a really Jake favored game and I will just like it. And the more we played it, the more I feel like you felt the game forced you down certain paths and it wasn't fun for you to sort of say, this is the path that I have to take. I think you want to feel like you are not just finding the optimal path, but choosing between multiple optimal paths and being creative about ending up there. And I think Great Western Trail, because of the way the tile set ends up being set at the beginning, there's A version versus B version. There's a little bit of that sort of same effect that's there in the Year of the Dragon, where you have this meaningful input randomness that happens before the game even starts being played, that you're then supposed to sort of read like an oracle and make decisions about that before you even start playing, strategic decisions. And that to you, I think, feels too restrictive. You want the game to be developing more as you play. And that comes along with the sort of punctuated waning decision spaces that you like, where you get the benefits of looking for the right path multiple times, so you get to feel a little bit more creative than it happening before the game even starts. So Castles of Burgundy is that way, another game that you really love, where every round all these new tiles come out to the board, and each time that happens, it's a new puzzle to solve. So linking and that uncertainty between those moments where the decision space grows to be really big again and then comes down, offers you the sort of creative flow. It offers you the benefits of it not being too clear of a decision space. And then also gives you high search at the start of each of those. So I think that's another sort of through line in games that you enjoy. And you've talked about that on the show. Sort of Azul is another example of a punctuated decision space that you really enjoy.
Totally. Yeah, I really agree with all that. I think the ability to creatively figure out the path that you're going down is a big one. And Great Western Trail is a great example to bring up, because I think part of the reason that one didn't work for me as much, and this isn't the only reason, but was the fact that you have basically 3 strategic paths. You could either go big engineers, go big cowboys, or go big, what's the last one? Builder?
Yeah.
Builder. And people who have played this game a lot will disagree, but that was kind of the sense I got, is you're picking one of those things and then just trying to hammer it to its fullest extent. And that felt a little bit unsatisfying to me strategically, where it's like it felt like the guardrails is pointing you to each of these strategies, versus something like Bonfire, where you're sort of like, okay, there's all these tasks out there, and I'm starting to like pick my way through them in a much more open feeling way.
You want to be a general contractor, not a plumber.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, perfect. I think the final thing that came to mind for me as sort of a broader category, though I'm going to interject before I get to my final point and say, I do think you like thinking about what other players are thinking about while playing games. Not everyone feels that way. And a through line to some of the games that you like, and not all, is this desire to consider what other people are thinking about, to try to use that to gain advantage. And I think without having that be a factor within your taste, you wouldn't like BattleCON as much as you do. And you wouldn't be interested in playing games like Dracula versus Van Helsing that we've been playing a lot, where you're trying to figure out why someone's doing what they're doing. And maybe you don't love that game for other reasons, but I think you like that, and it keeps it interesting.
Yeah, I think I'm a bit of a defender of quote unquote multiplayer solitaire games, but I think the reason that I tend to defend them is that I think people by and large don't give enough credit to the interactive nature of games like Castles of Burgundy, where yes, you're building out your own board, but a core important piece of that game is like competing over the entire tile set. And that, so for me, it's like, it's enough generally if there's one core element of the game that is highly interactive. And I do want that. And in that, I get a lot of joy out of considering what other players are going to be doing. And, that is often a place where you can have sort of epiphanies and make greater plays in subsequent plays than you did the first time around. So I do want there to be an element of that. Though I definitely not as much as you, right? This kind of like the psychological donkey space of guessing what my opponent's doing all the time. I think I might be like, if this is sort of a spectrum from totally dependent interactive games to games with no interaction at all, my sweet spot is on that lower end of things. I would say more often than I'm more likely to want to play a kind of point salad Euro game than I am to play a highly interactive game.
So maybe El Grande is a good example that illustrates different things about our taste. I like El Grande because of some of the simultaneous decisions in that game a lot more than I would like it if it was more static. You like it because of the action efficiencies and the high search potentially that's going on there, or I guess it's not super high search, but there's some search there in finding the sort of right solution to the board state, and then the moderate clarity for sure. So it's because of that that you like it, but it doesn't matter that that's what was causing the moderate clarity.
Right. I think that's right.
Okay.
Like the actual like Castillo reveal part is
Yeah.
like that is the moment where we're all sort of predicting what everybody else is going to be doing. There's a couple actions that do that, and that's not my favorite part of the game.
Yeah.
That's
And I
that's
love
part
that
of the
part.
game that I'm fine with because I like the rest of the game
Yeah.
so much.
You can stomach it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
totally.
Okay. Maybe then what you enjoy is when that happens in lower player count games, like a dueling game. You enjoy that more than, because I just think about, you enjoy fighting games too. Like Smash is something you've
Yeah.
played a lot. But maybe it's despite those things. I don't
No,
know.
I think that's a great point. I think generally when I'm thinking about board games, I'm considering multiplayer beyond 2-player games.
Yeah.
But I think if I was like, it would almost be a different list if I was like, what are your quintessential 2-player games? Because I
Sure.
just want such different things in those player counts.
I think that's really illustrative also that your quintessential, something about your quintessential games are that they are multiplayer games, right? Um,
Yeah,
At
right.
least,
No, it's
yeah,
a great
that's what
point.
you want to be. The final thing that I had on my list was sort of broad characterizations are synergies. You love games that explore synergies, which this, to your point, this is why the sort of action efficiency is kind of breaks down as a helpful label for things because it can mean things so broadly. But I think this is the through line that makes you enjoy things like Bruges and Challengers at the same time, where there's these cards that you can mix and match their effectiveness and exploring what's the best way to bring those cards together, which also gives you these aha moments that you really love. The joy of epiphany being an example. Synergies give you the joy of epiphany because all of a sudden you figure out, oh, this card is supposed to go in this deck with this card when this is true because it completes the puzzle in this way. And then it feels really cool. And that's all made possible by these synergies that are like malleable puzzle pieces where you have to see, they don't necessarily fit strictly together. They fit loosely together. And it's about knowing when to fit them together and why.
Yeah. I think this is another one that is I'm a bit of a mixed bag on because one thing I don't like in these multiplayer games I'm talking about is when we're seeing a lot of new cards over the course of the game with text on them that I then have to like read and internalize. Not always my favorite thing, but I love this type of thing, especially in 2-player dueling games, whether it's Magic the Gathering or Keyforge or Riftforce. There's definitely an element where I get a lot out of that. And I think one of the cool things that synergy enables too is a lot of thinking about the game outside of the game. And I think when a game can provide satisfying, rich, thoughtful moments outside the game, like one thing I like about challengers so much is that like whenever I'm playing the game, if I'm playing it on Board Game Arena, I almost always find a moment where I want to like screenshot my decision so I can go back to the Discord and talk to people about like what's the right decision here, what's more optimal. And I think so much of those conversations and so much about games that enable those kinds of conversations are that they lean into synergies.
Cool. Okay. So we explored a lot of things you like. And I think that's an important way of identifying what's quintessentially you. But also looking at what's not quintessentially Jake can be helpful for informing this. So is it fair to say, Jake, that you're not a big fan of thematic games for which the thematic experience is the primary appeal?
Yes, I think that's fair. And I think
Root,
when I
Burgle
hear
Bros.
that,
Yeah.
like my brain just translates that into mechanics not that solid.
Interesting.
Which
What?
maybe that's fair or not, but like games that tend to be theme forward, I think often will make concessions to mechanical, fun, interesting mechanics from a gameplay perspective or balance from a gameplay perspective to make it the most thematic game possible. Not always the case, but like if somebody's like the best thing about this game is like the theme, that's not a selling point for me.
Sure. Yeah. 100%. Like something even like Millennium Blades, where part of the joy of that is the theme that's being sort of
Yeah, and I
presented.
even love that theme, right? Like, that
Yeah.
theme, it means a ton to me, both from, like, a nostalgic perspective, or in, like, implementing the kind of a theme from video games I love. Like, I love kind of those, like, sorta RPG collectible card games, but yeah, like, when it comes down to the play of the game on the table, the gameplay is, for me, has to be number 1
The driving
priority.
force.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so then my next question was, do you prefer games that take place above the table or on the table? And
This is a
I think there's
question.
there's a well, there's no question in my mind. Here's a question that I'm putting out of the world, and I don't think there's any question in your mind. Do you want to answer this one?
Yeah. For me, I much prefer games that take place on the table.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit
This is
it
a joke
almost feels
question.
like a little bit of an unfair question because there has to be some above the table element. I like that existing too in my games,
Sure.
but I want the bulk, the 51% or more, to be happening on the table.
Yeah.
With exceptions, like everything else. Like, I love the resistance, and there's no board in that at all.
Yeah.
So with all these things, there are definitely exceptions to the rule. But yeah, I mean, I tend to not like negotiation games very much at all. I tend to not like area control or area majority games when there's negotiation or allyship, creating allies with other players is a key mechanism and part of what's going on. So I think it's fair to say that, if we're looking at these things from a spectrum, yeah, I want the bulk of the experience to be like, what are we doing mechanically on the table, more so than like what deals are being made above the table.
Yeah. Do you think I know you've only played it once or maybe twice, but in Imperial 2030, that game is so close to being 50-50 between those two things. But ultimately, if a game is close to being 50% on the table and 50% above the table through political agencies, it warps the game so much that it really doesn't matter how much is existing on the table. That's a game where I think all of the mechanics there are interesting to you, but in practice and through the act of playing the game, it tilts away from a game that you enjoy really at all because it forfeits some of the interesting mechanisms to provide room for social dynamics that you'd rather experience in a game purely dedicated to them than ones that's trying to mix and match a little of this and a little of that.
I think that's fair. I need to play Imperial
Sure.
2030 again since I also have only had that one play. Did we play it 6 players?
I think so. Maybe 5. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever the max player count is, we did that, and I felt like that also reduced the on the board agency, where
Yeah.
that balance might be more in my taste if we had a 4-player game, which is what everybody recommends. But yeah, definitely the games, yeah, that like sort of lean into a single mechanism maybe is how I find that kind of thing palatable. A game, another sort of exception is Santiago, which is a negotiation game, and it's all, I don't know, it's tough. Like, that one is sort of like a negotiation game that feels like more above the table than on the table, probably, but I still really like it. So there are definitely like exceptions, and with all these things, even if it doesn't tend to suit my taste, I wouldn't say like if you play Santiago, you'll know what kind of games I like. That wouldn't make sense. But if the game is really well done, even if it's not quintessentially me, I could still find a lot of enjoyment in it.
Yeah, cool. And so you mentioned the sort of wanting to defend low interaction games or games that some people might say are low interaction. Would you say you have a preference for interactive games or less interactive games?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of gets into the same conversation we were having about that.
Yeah,
Where I don't know that I have. I think I want games to be like the highest interactive games, right? The games that are totally interactive. So I'm thinking of like games that have. For me, when I think about that, I think pure negotiation games.
yeah,
Like, I played I'm the Boss at a Geekway, and like that did absolutely nothing for me at all. Didn't enjoy it at all. So I think like the games that are extremely high interact, where you basically don't care about the board. I guess Vadis is another example of that. That's like one of our like famous biggest disagreements on this podcast, where ultimately the board doesn't matter at all because players have complete agency to determine the outcome of the game at the last minute by throwing into like one person or another's pot. That is not something that I like in games. But like, do I prefer interactive or non-interactive games? That feels like almost like a trap question because I still want interactive games. I just don't want like the most extreme end of that.
Cool.
Because I actually think I don't like games that have no interaction.
Yeah. Yeah. You like Azul more than you like Cascadia.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think a key reason because for that is the interactive potential of Azul is higher than Cascadia, even if it exists in Cascadia. You just have a little bit more agency in Azul, typically, to craft the decision space towards interacting and denying versus Cascadia.
Yeah. And I don't need it to be like I would say Cascadia. I still like Cascadia a lot. I think it's a great game. So for me, there's enough interaction in that game to like sort of satisfy my criteria of there must be some interaction in the game.
Yeah. Planet Unknown is coming to mind for me as another game kind of in the space where my sense is that game doesn't have quite as much interaction as you would like, but it's doing enough other things that you enjoy that you still really love that game. Planet Unknown, of course, is this sort of polyomino laying game in which you are filling in planets, trying to move up these different tracks. And there's a cool drafting system where you're picking from a shared tab display, more or less.
I think Planet Unknown has more interaction than you might think just because had a recent game night with friends and there were like 3 or 4 turns where in a row the table was like colluding against me getting a specific shape, which is great, like that. I like that, games that have interaction as a leverage point, but players have to leverage it, right, in sort of a strategic and emergent way. That's something that I enjoy more so than games that, kind of hit you over the head with like, you have to be trading with people, right? You have to do XYZ. I think like as in with any mechanism, right, it has to be done thoughtfully and intentionally, right, versus just like more. I don't agree with the sentiment that players over time eventually start preferring more and more interactive games, which is something I've seen expressed in our Discord and in other places as well.
Okay. I'm going to propose contenders for 5 quintessentially Jake games. And I think any list of quintessentially Jake games, you could there's a lot of games in the world and you could probably pick different games. But I want to name these and see what you think, how well I did coming up with examples. And in one of these, I'm going to cheat and say that I could have said this or this. So my list of, if I was picking 5 games to represent you, I would pick Tikal, Bonfire, which could also be Castles of Burgundy, or could actually also be Carpe Diem, or could actually be Bruges. I think any of those games could just stand in for one another here, and I wouldn't bat an eye once. A Feast for Odin, Broom Service, and Challengers. I felt like with these 5 games, / one that could have been just pick whatever you like out of these Steffenfeld games, which Steffenfeld, I think, does represent a lot of quintessentially Jake taste elements mechanically. These 5, I think really well represent. And I guess I could have thrown something like Findorff in place of maybe Broom Service or in place of maybe Tikal.
Yeah, I thought about Findorff too because it was sort of a game that I felt like was on the outlier of my like personal rating. Like that's a game that I feel like I enjoy more than the average player.
Sure.
So that's another way you could kind of consider this list and like, so this must say something about me, but I ultimately didn't include it because I don't think somebody would come away from that knowing exactly what I like in games. But it does have some elements that I really love. So, I mean, I think your list is great. I'll just go through them really quickly. And then there's at least one other sort of like mechanism that I think we didn't touch on that I think is quintessentially me, but you actually have it included in this list here too. And it's also in Findorff. So Tikal, I talked about a lot on this podcast already. and it's also one I picked on my personal list. So we just crossed over there. And I think the thing with Tikal that it highlights about me, even though it's sort of an exception to area majority type of games, which I tend to not like, I think that's actually something that's changing about me as I've explored more of these kind of like Mask Trilogy games and some other that I've been playing with in my local Monday night game group. Like I feel like I'm softening on that position. Like there's a lot of exceptions to that rule at this point.
Sure.
So yeah, so I think the thing about Tikal is like it's quintessentially me because it's like the game that best evokes a feeling of games that you can improve at and learn more about the system through play. Bonfire is an awesome choice. I think one thing that it really like leans into is that sort of determining your strategy as it goes. I think maybe a game like Castles of Burgundy would be a slightly better choice in sort of hitting that midweight Euro. It's probably a good idea to include at least one Steffenfeld game, just because I really like Steffenfeld games. They kind of share this like unique action selection element, which is a mechanism that I always tend to enjoy that particular designer's takes on. So I like that a lot. And I mean, I tend to like a solid midweight Euro, and I tend to like a point salad style of, determining the winner. So I think it's a good choice there for all of those reasons. I think A Feast for Odin, even though it was previously a super high ranked game for me and still is probably one I would leave off this list just because it tends to be too long. And I actually had the opportunity to play this recently because I think there was going to be a Monday night game night that a few people weren't going to make. And then ultimately people did make it. But Jared's like, let's play Feast for Odin. It's like your favorite game. And my like gut reaction is like, just seems like too much to like set it up and get it played.
You'd rather play 2 midweight games than 1 heavy game.
Yeah, or even a midweight game and a couple of filler games.
Sure.
Something like that. I just think is better suits my taste. But in a game that like emphasizes that high search, I think that's a great choice for it. I love that you included Broom Service. It also has that sort of punctuated waning decision space that I love. And I like that it also highlights that I do enjoy interactive games. I it's not that the and like the kind of like psychological play maybe isn't something that I need to have, but like when it is handled, I think in a really intentional way can just add a ton of replayability to the game. And it also has a lot of those fits, things we've already touched on. Like it's a midweight Euro, plays relatively quickly, allows you to kind of come up with your own strategy over the course of game and try and carry it out. So, and lots of like mini path picking in each different round of the game. So that is definitely one that could fit well on a quintessential games list. And then challengers, which I also picked. And I think the reason I picked this is not something that we've touched on before on this episode, but I think I really like a game. I like metagaming in games.
But what do you mean by metagaming? Because you don't mean the political side of the game things. You mean something else.
Yeah, what I mean is like I grew up playing Magic the Gathering, right? And I enjoyed that, like identifying a meta, like going to a tournament, seeing how your strategy fares against opponents based on like what they ended up, determining about the meta and bring out. And challengers gives me the opportunity to live that without all the downsides of like trying to show up at a competitive card game tournament. So I think it fits really well on this like games list that like helps explain like what I like in games, because I could actually share that experience with somebody by presenting the challengers in a way that I could not with a different, with like I'm not going to like bring somebody to a Magic the Gathering or Keyforge tournament with me to like show them what games I like. Though
in an hour you'll see what's great about this.
Yeah, but that experience of like going to a card game tournament like that would show them something. They'd be like, "You like this?" I'd be like, "Actually, yeah."
Yeah, totally.
Like, okay, weirdo. Yeah, so I think I think that is good. And then we've talked a little bit about kind of like like my preference for like tactical versus strategic games, and I do think that's true. Sort of like on the bulk of it being on the tactical side of things, but I actually really love games that force you to make incredibly consequential decisions early on, right? Like picking some form of strategy early on and then like kind of seeing how that goes. And Challengers kind of fits that a little bit, right? In the you can abandon ship and switch to another strategy. But a 3 rounds into the game, like you're really kind of setting yourself up for something, and then seeing how that goes over the balance of it. So that's another reason I think Challengers is a good pick. Though you could pick something like Riftforce, also by Plan B game. Is it Plan B game? No, One More Time Games.
Yep.
That like more explicitly has you draft the factions you'll be using in the start of the game. So I wanted to pick something like that too, or even I included. I'll share some of my list, but Voyages of Marco Polo is another game that kind of has that, where you get a little bit of asymmetry, which is something I don't always like in games, but then also has you doing the kind of Ticket to Ride style destination setting at the beginning of the game. So you're determining like what routes, what cities you're trying to get to before the end of the game. So I really like that from kind of like a long-term strategy perspective, where you get to like pick that up front, and then it's all tactics to like try to achieve what you've decided for yourself. And then I also like, one thing I always like in games is where you get to like call your shot, right? Like through some mechanism, say, I'm going to accomplish this, and then you do it or you don't. I always like games that have that. So that kind of Ticket to Ride element in Voyages of Marco Polo, and then also Marco Polo being this like midweight Euro that plays in about an hour, that has like a punctuated waiting decision space, makes it one for me. I don't always talk about the game, but like actually hits a ton of boxes on like a quintessentially me list. Um, I've mentioned, this was my list of 10 games. Voyage of Marco Polo, Riftforce, we already mentioned. Challengers, we've already mentioned. Tikal, we've already mentioned. I included Sea Salt and Paper as a game. As we talked at the very beginning about short versus long games. I also really like short games, where you could like bust out at work, play over coffee in the morning, do a round or two really quickly, and then pack it up and move on. And Sea Salt and Paper is a game that works really well for that sort of slot, which I feel like having one game like that would be important for me to show people in what I like about games. And then this also has like a really prominent call your shot mechanic, where you can call for the end of the round in one of two ways. And actually, a lot of the kind of decision space and improving in this game is totally wrapped up in that mechanic. So those were the 5 games that I put for like mechanical games that lean into the mechanics. But we don't talk about this as much on this podcast because this is the decision space show. But I also really love social games that lean into being social. And I'm not talking as much about, above the table play, but games that are like all about being social. So The Resistance is one that I included as a game that is kind of quintessentially me, just because like it has this element of like being able, like allowing you to experience real emotional turmoil, which I think is a funny thing to say in a episode about games that I love, but like I love that games can offer like these like rich emotional experiences. So that's why I would want to show that to somebody. I included Monikers on my list as well, which has nothing to do with mechanics and all about it's being a game that allows you to like perform for your friends and enjoy the performances of your friends and just be like really silly in a safe game night space. So I mean, that's a game that I feel like is quintessentially like one of the things that I love coming to games for, though not something that always fits into this podcast discussion as much. I included So Clover as a social game for the same reasons. And there specifically is a game that allows you to be really clever and enjoy how clever your friends and colleagues and people you're playing the game with are. doing that in like kind of this social setting, I feel like brings that to the fore more so than being like outwitted or outmatched in like a tactical strategy game. And then the last two don't really fit on this podcast, but on this list, but they do for me. I included the drinking game called Baseball that my friends and I used to play in undergrad all the time. It's basically a combination between beer pong and flip cup. So I love that it has like this element of dexterity, but it's also a team game. Like any game that allows you to be like a team with somebody, whether it's a partnership trick taking game or Captain Sonar. I think a team games are something that I really love that games can offer. And the last one I included is sports.
Nice.
My favorite social game of all time, kickball.
Nice. What do you think? Why do you think you enjoy sports so much? Just generally, you love playing sports, you love watching sports. I think there's a lot of people who are listening to the show who probably don't love sports. So, in terms of, you've included it here on a list of quintessentially Jake games as a broad category. What about sports as games have this broad appeal for you? And I think,
well, Brendan,
yeah,
do you have another hour?
I don't.
Okay, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a big question. I think part of it is like I love that sports are games that you can play outside. I think that's really nice when I can, be enjoying a beautiful day and playing a game. That's a big plus with it. I love that sports don't just demand your mind, but couple that mind with like your body, and kind of like games are all about one kind of intelligence or multiple kinds of intelligence, but rarely about like the sort of like kinesthetic intelligence of like do what I want, what I've figured out is the best thing to do in my mind with my whole body. And dexterity
Yeah.
games offer that a little bit, but like a team sport where you've got 22 people in a dictated space, all moving their full bodies in different ways, trying to like coordinate and get on the same page. Like, in some ways soccer can be, crokinole and the mind and chess all at the same time.
Sure.
That we're also happen to be playing, simultaneously with 22 people. So, and then there's social aspects to it too, where like, you get the magic circle of a game, but you get it just in like a very different feeling way where you're kind of like sharing this separate one with your whole team. But then you're like your team as a unit and the other team as a unit are kind of like coming together to create another like shared massive circle. I've joked on this podcast a lot about games, or as sports being sort of like the mega game version of a dexterity game.
Sure.
But that's just something I actually believe. And I won't fight the fight about sports being quote unquote board games anymore, because I think I've lost that battle. I've basically got nobody ever to agree with me on that. But I like to bring them up from time to time in this podcast about, primarily board games, as something that I think board gamers should try more and at least realize that are existing on the same spectrum as the games that we love to play in our game rooms. I hear too much sort of like disparaging sports ball comments amongst people in the board game space. And it always just doesn't, I mean, I don't care. It doesn't really bother me, but it just makes me pause because it just seems so silly and almost like gatekeepy of people who maybe their primary outlet for play is their recreational basketball league on Tuesday nights, and we're gathering in our living rooms, our Tuesday night game groups, and to not realize that like both sets of people are really engaging in almost entirely the same type of thing with the same types of benefit. It feels like an oversight.
Totally. Well, I think that was really well put. I love this opportunity to delve into your taste because I think you have really interesting tastes that sort of reflect this whole sphere of board gaming that I have great affection for and appreciate a lot, that overlaps a little bit with what I enjoy, but is totally different. So I just want to say thank you. And then I want to give you the closing word on your quintessentially Jake episode.
Well, I just hope that people enjoyed this episode and can't wait to run it back in the near future. Probably not next week, but in a few weeks with Brendan's Quintessential Games. And if you enjoyed this podcast and would like us to do it again, we're definitely going to do it at least with Brendan, because that would just be cruel and unusual punishment if he had to go through this exercise but doesn't get to do it himself. But I think this could be an interesting kind of thought experiment to run with our regular guests. I think it'd be interesting to see what like Paul or Jamie or maybe other game designers or people in the gaming space that we haven't had on before would think about this question and kind of thought experiment. So if you want more of this type of episode and content, please let us know, because we will absolutely take your thoughts and feedback into account as we plan for future episodes of this podcast.
Cool. As a friendly reminder, we're going to cover games like Combo Castle coming
Castle
up.
Combo.
Castle Combo and Mexica. I think for Castle Combo, we'll see if we give it its own episode or if we talk broadly about the type of game that it is and kind of roll it up within that episode itself. But definitely Mexico getting the full deep dive treatment. And yeah, we hope you'll play those games along with us. They're on Board Game Arena in one way, shape, or form. And we'd also love for you to come talk with us about Jake's Taste. Come discuss this episode with us in our Discord. You can find a link to it in our show notes or on our website, decisionspacepodcast.com, where you can find more things all about Decision Space.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for listening and have a great week.
Bye, y'all.
Did we thank Hembry?
No, but we should.
Hembry. Thank you, Hembry, for our intro and outro song. Reach out. Bye, y'all.
Bye.